Yeah, so we have John Harden. John, thanks very much for joining, man. It's a real pleasure. You and I have been hanging out for the last couple of years, through the CompTIA SaaS Advisory Council, SaaS Ecosystem Advisory Council, which we both sit on, and it's been good hanging out. But you've had a few changes in the last year, and so hopefully we'll get into a little bit of that. But welcome and give us a bit of your little history here.
Yeah, sure. First off, congrats, Luis, on the bump up in the panel, the vice chair now, right? I think that's you heard about that, right? You're not hearing about that from me live.
No, I did hear about it. Yeah, so thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, a bunch of vendors, really commit a lot of their time to volunteer for the CompTIA advisory councils. And some of them are doing some really interesting work. We actually started doing some really interesting work around helping MSPs better implement a process around the procurement of SaaS tools. And this applies equally to individual businesses out there too. But in one of our big planning meetings a few months ago, we kind of set out this big goal for next year to really dig into the various different areas of proper procurement planning for SaaS apps and due diligence and all those things. And so I think it kind of behooves everybody to get better at that. And John's been a big part of that. So thanks for your contribution as well.
Of course, yeah. Well, I guess do a quick introduction, and we'll go on from there. We've got a jam-packed opportunity to talk quite a bit here, but that kind of segues perfectly. My background, I spent about 12 years in a managed service provider space before moving and launching SaaSleo, the business. Now I can't even say SaaSleo. I can always call it all SaaS management. So spent about 12 years. I started in the NOC. I was help desk. I was out troubleshooting anything and everything, setting up servers, Linux, Windows, everything alike. Moved up to director level in that space on strategy initiatives. Launched SaaSleo March 2020, about as good of a time as you can launch a business as any.
Right.
Nobody wants to talk to you during that time because everybody thinks you're going to give them COVID, but here we are. That business grew until it was acquired last November by a business called Auvik, which now I'm kind of repping their shirt. So if you haven't heard about them, that's what they do. Auvik is a network management company, but is looking to expand the visibility beyond the normal edge and into the SaaS tools and some of the other creative areas. But I have spent 12 years in an MSP and about 3.5 now learning how to maximize your talk track and your discussion around SaaS with your clients. It's an interesting space, and we can all thank Benioff with his no software logo back in the day with Salesforce and the launch of the SaaS kind of ecosystem to be why we're here talking today. And so lots of different areas we could take it, from procurement to shadow IT to how to manage it, how to talk to your clients about it. So we've got a talk track. I know, Luis, we're going to hit it. We're going to nail it down, but I don't know the format of these. I'm always open for curveball questions too along the way. So
I'll try to make them contextual. We'll see what comes out based on what you're saying. I tend to also, if I disagree on something, I'll kind of say it. But that makes for fun conversation too sometimes. But let's dig right in because, you said it just now, shadow IT, and I have felt like, this has been slowly creeping into the management context of what MSPs are doing over the last few years. Like, this wasn't really an issue, I'd say 10 years ago. But certainly it's a whole other beast, 5 years to now. I think it's been a really interesting evolution of shadow IT, the SaaS apps, the subscription models, the cost inefficiencies. There's so many little things there, but you've been deep in this. And so where do you see the roots of shadow IT, and how did it start kind of getting out there?
Yeah, so you mentioned the growth and the curve, by the way. I have some data to support that. So about 7 years ago, that average 100-person company was using anywhere from about 5 to 8 SaaS applications. Now, flash forward to where we are, that same average 100-person company is using about 126 SaaS applications. That's straight from Gartner analysis. Those are facts, right, that they've come out with. And a lot of it boils down to a couple key things. I think there were a couple key motions. COVID accelerated it. Everybody felt that digital transformation that really bumped the number up into the right. But shadow IT, I've spent a handful of years studying it. There's only a couple, there's 2 main resources in which shadow IT enter an organization, 2 main pathways. There's a few ancillary ones, but these are the main pathways. And I guess maybe step back. Shadow IT, let me define it for some folks maybe. Shadow IT is just those applications, those utilities, those SaaS tools, those software tools. Heck, my mouse could be shadow IT if my IT team doesn't have it inventoried and asseted, that the IT team doesn't know about. But in this context, it's that IT that your clients are procuring and using that you don't know about. And that's how I like to look at it, because you're the IT team for your business or for the clients you serve. And so, in general, the two ways, it's pretty cut and dried. One is entrepreneurism, innovation. I am an employee. My job is difficult. My OKRs keep going up. I have so many things to get done, and I need to get it done fast. So I go online and I start finding tools to make my job easier. This can yield itself in the emergence that we saw earlier in the year with like ChatGPT. It could be a productivity tool where I found myself more productive because I had the ChatGPT to help make my job easier. It could yield itself into tools like Airtable or Smartsheet, some of those like platforms that let us do a little bit more data transformation easier. But it can easily yield itself into like a marketing intern who was asked to just go, send out an event list, and all of a sudden they sign up for MailChimp and there's data in there. So the first one's really just entrepreneurism, innovation. It's a good thing, by the way. The second source is usually an educational gap. Let's take that same marketing intern. They join the company. The CEO says, we're having a golf outing. Make sure you invite all of my clients to the golf outing. Marketing intern gets the list of clients from the CEO, goes out, does their job, achieves their job, but doesn't realize that there was a proper platform internally to get it done. So what it is an education gap. There might already be an answer, or there might already be a couple answers in the business on which they should have gone down. And so they've gone and innovated, but they innovated incorrectly because they didn't know the right pathways to do it. And I think we can all empathize with the pain of that marketing intern, joining a company, there's an overwhelming amount of applications in use. Nobody really centrally manages it or documents it. And so we just do our job. Lots of different ways, but it really kind of consolidates down to one, it's that entrepreneurism, it's that solving a problem. And by the way, that doesn't always have to be positive, but mostly I find it is. And that educational gap, that lack of awareness that the answer are already out there.
And even on the culture piece, it feels like it may be by happenstance, that person coming in feels like they're being unnecessarily stifled, held back. They can't do their job, and this becomes sort of a negative culture issue. When in fact the reality is the security culture of it had not been shared or inculcated enough to try and help people understand that we're not trying to make your job more difficult. We're simply have these processes in place, and here's the reason why. And I think a lot of people still don't understand why those things are important, or don't realize the kinds of ways that data gets accidentally leaked or let out, so to speak. And so it's a consistent challenge for sure. And I can't tell you the number of times where I got an email from a client of my MSP where they were trying to send a mail campaign, and they were getting like bounce backs from every single recipient. The reason is because we had DMARC on their domain, and they had just signed up for a new campaign platform that they hadn't told us about. And of course, there weren't any DKIM records, no SPF records, nothing. They just kind of went and did it. So I've certainly experienced this issue, and so we have to sort of go through the exercise of doing that. So I guess my question to you is, how do you front load that conversation? What strategies have you found MSPs to be successful in doing that? Because with all the turnover at the clients, sometimes it's just difficult to have this conversation over and over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, really what you're trying to do is get in front of the core problem, which is employees often go down the path of least resistance, right? There's always your bad actors that are, using shadow IT in a malicious exfiltration type of event or something like that. But the amount of those events are, one for every 1,000 somebody try to solve a problem in a clean, healthy way. And I think the way that it begins is during that client journey, establishing that, you're here to be with them to really do discovery. I talk about it through automated ways, and it's kind of hard, it's a challenging task to do it manually, which is why we're here, or I'm here at least. But establishing this conversation track with the customer around the fact that while we may not be managing every one of your SaaS tools, I'm not going to go in and handle all your employee onboards and offboards. And while I might not be in here to, set up the configurations of your SaaS tools, because that would be crazy to try to have to support every one of your end client SaaS tools. I am here to help give you advice and build an inventory and maintain that repository of what you've got in your ecosystem from a compliance perspective or from an efficiency perspective. Just like you use maybe an RMM to manage the software inventory of what's installed, you also need to be there kind of advising and building, maintaining an inventory, whether it be manual or automated, of all the SaaS tools, because that's kind of where your job is on the documentation side of managing their ecosystem. So establishing that communication that, hey, we're not going to stop your innovation. We don't want the employees to look at us as the department of no. But when SaaS tools go through that procurement process, we want to be in the fold so that we know where your data is at. And that starts with the client onboarding journey, and that becomes part of your QBR journey of asking what tools they're adopting and what software they're using to get their job done. Is there new SaaS that they look to procure in their journey along the way that is up for renewal or whatever it might be?
And I remember some software vendors kind of it was an interesting way to generate some business. I remember Dropbox, for example, whenever we had a regular call, would come to us and be like, hey, so we can give you a report of people in your customers' domains that have like personal accounts. That might be something you want to go talk to them about, moving those accounts into business accounts and getting control of the data. And so they're effectively identifying shadow IT for you. And obviously now with the advent of tools like Saslio, now I don't know if you guys renamed that under the Auvik brand to something else entirely, but Saslio kind of automates that, because now when people are actually using certain things with certain accounts, and it's easy to know if your customer doesn't have a Dropbox business account that you're not managing or not reselling, obviously. And each one of those, by the way, is also, of course, a resale opportunity. But I think the bigger issue clearly being security. But let's get into the QBR component of that. By the way, folks, if you have questions about this for John, and John has been literally in the thick of this shadow IT stuff for several years now, so he's a good guy to ask questions from. Yeah, a good point from Brian. Is the app using the right credential, business versus personal? And I kind of named this out here in some of the other issues, which is password reuse. I think that's exactly one of the challenges that happens when you're not driving some of the business accounts into single sign-on. Then there's obviously password reuse, and they might be using a business password on a personal account, and that stuff often gets out, compromises the business. So I think it's important to, in the QBR process, to sort of maybe even paint a bit of the picture of all the use cases or potential ways that some of this shadow IT stuff creates a risk for the business. John, have you found that you guys, even from the Saslio marketing, kind of painting a bit of that picture to help MSPs better communicate it to their clients?
Yeah, so I will help. I have to do my, I have a PMM, so my one thing I got to fix is it is all of Access Management now, but I answer to both names. Whatever you call me, I'll respond to. So that's one shameless plug. And so what it boils down to is this culture of back and forth and interacting in the QBR journey. Sorry, it just kind of threw me off there a little bit, but in the QBR discussion, the way that we coach it to be tackled is building into the shadow IT as top 10 shadow IT every quarter. That's actually our prescription from our onboard journey and from our customer success journey, is embedding a top 10 shadow IT into your QBR discussion. And obviously it's really hard to do that if you don't have an automated tool. So I want to try to give some tips here that don't require our product, because I always like to actually help instead of just say you have to use this tool to get there. But the top 10 shadow IT is a really healthy discussion track. And we never talk about is this app, we never ask the question, is this app approved? We try to avoid that question. We try to ask what business problem is being solved with this software. I have some opinions on SaaS, as you can tell. My first opinion on SaaS is it's part business problem, part IT. Nobody's signing up for SaaS just for fun. ChatGPT might be the only exception, or one of the few exceptions. Most people aren't signing up for software for fun. They're trying to achieve a business outcome. And so opening up that dialogue on a quarterly cadence around, if you have the list from a solution like ours, great. Here's the top 10 things we've seen grow in your business. What are you doing about them? Are these things that, what business problems are they solving? Great. But even without the list, you could start to open up the dialogue around, what SaaS tools are you using to solve business problems? Is there anything new since the last time we talked? But what it really boils down to is opening that discussion so that the customer knows they can come to you and talk about SaaS tools. Fundamentally, we did a study here across all of our SaaS management data. The average employee in our system is spending 62% of their time in their browser and only 38% on the desktop apps. And so we've seen this massive shift to the cloud and the web app where we're not seeing visibility. And so it takes the onus on us to help unlock the discussions around what they're doing in the browser and what they're using in the browser so that we can be strategic IT managers of their environment.
Because if they're not downloading apps, obviously RMM's not going to report on it. You're not going to potentially see half of this of stuff that's going on. Even when it's not necessarily shadow IT, like maybe they're just signing into a personal Gmail account. But this is where a lot of data loss comes from. I've had those issues where a client said, "Hey, we think this person's been sending lists of customers to a competitor," and so like how do you even discover the folks that are potentially doing that? Because all you see in firewall reports is Gmail if they're a Google Workspace, or Outlook if they're a 365 customer. So not a lot of visibility unless you have the tools for it. I wonder if I could, I pinged Mark behind the scenes and said, "Hey, can you bring up a little bit of a screenshot of what is in the LCI console for some of this SaaS management component?" Because we have an integration with you guys. And I feel like this is such a powerful conversation piece for QBRs or just ongoing discussions. It certainly helps sort of start at least that security awareness component. But let me stop sharing here in case you want to share your screen there.
Yeah, you kind of pressured me and said, "Hey, can you put a screenshot?" And I'm like, "There's so many screens on."
Just maybe share your screen and walk us through a couple of things.
Okay, so I am sharing my screen now. Hopefully everybody can see it. Okay, cool. So this is the SaaSleo reporting for Creative Designs. That's my company. I found this under more reports under SaaSleo right there. And we do have a couple of views. There's a detail view and a summary view, and all these views, by the way, that you can select on here can be put on a business review format proper. So the summary view doesn't have anything because it's been a while since we actually updated our SaaSleo product, but this would chart security logs and whatnot. And the details view would just tell you which application you have, what category it is. If it's medium, high risk, and classified, that's the application summary. The application usage now you can tell when it was added. And then we have more application breaches, tells you the description of it, classified information managed by partner if need be. There's user summary. There is user application usage. So Jeffrey Fletcher application was Tracksoft. It was a finance thing. It's a very high risk. And then we have security logs for as something that we can show as well for your partners. So those are the things that you can add, and you can add whatever you want from all those views, and or add all the views if need be, if you want to talk about that with your clients.
And I think that's the key thing there. If you want to jump over to that key view, Brian made a good point here. I know, Brian, thanks for teeing us around. You're a great customer to work with here. But on the app view itself, if we go to the application summary, what we're often talking about and what the views have to do with this. So first, that risk score right there is really around shadow IT risk in the organization. In the platform itself, we have the ability to move it into being a managed by partner state, or it's a managed by client state, and who the individual user is down there. And even further, we have the ability to kind of manage the lifecycle stage if it's approved or not to change that security score or that risk score. And I think that what we really hone in on there is bringing this dashboard and focusing on the top 10 shadow IT. And I think this is one of the big challenges. Again, like when you clicked on the integrations, there's a couple options. I'm really agnostic in the world. Like I just want to educate, but my key thing here is no matter how you go about this, do not try to boil the oceans around shadow IT and SaaS management. One of the biggest challenges that we've seen the MSP space when they're adopting SaaS management tools is come in and feel this need or this desire, just as they do, because we're IT folk, of managing everything. I have 139 apps. I need to know who's approved. If it's not, who's the owner, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at like CIS 2.3, it really talks about quarterly reviews of the applications and bringing in unapproved apps. It says nothing about having to have a consistent everyday review of all the platforms. And so addressing unauthorized software, it's review monthly or more frequently. And that's where we recommend just pulling shadow IT into review monthly or more frequently. In this case, quarterly, if you're using a quarterly review. Because it can slowly build up that inventory over a year. If you're doing top 10, that's 40 apps. If you're bringing in your stack, that's probably 30, 40 apps. You've probably got half the stack already identified within that first year. And that becomes something that gets a little stickier with the client too, because any MSP they may have to transfer to, that's a whole reset button on the environment for them. When they leave, have to go reset all that information and collect it all.
Thanks so much, Mark, for showing us that stuff. That's awesome. And I think, Brian clued me into something that is, I think, an even bigger problem, because part of the challenge is actually not so much when they're using it and they're an employee, but when they leave and they still have access to all this data because nobody knew they were using that tool, or it hadn't been identified, or IT hadn't, any clue that this user had to be offboarded from something that they have no control over. So how do you, and they signed up with their personal email address, and you can't get any kind of reset or things like that. So I think the identification process throughout is, I think, an important part of mitigating some of the security risk. But again, you kind of don't learn these things until you've had one of those instances or scenarios happen to you. And then clients kind of don't feel at risk until they've had that situation either. And so where is that happy medium of like getting them to listen to the security risk conversation without, feeling like, oh, this doesn't apply to us? It's kind of the same thing around cybersecurity, just in general.
Yeah, I have found a fairly good entry point on shadow IT as a good layer to start a cyber conversation. Again, I'm a hammer, everything's a nail, like everything's SaaS management in my world. But the reality is, like, SaaS is something that CFOs, CEOs, CROs, CMOs, CTO, like, it doesn't matter what your C-suite title is, they all use SaaS. So it's not what I call sometimes invisibleware, right? Like, it's not that stuff that I don't get to see value out of, because I get it as a CFO, because I know about SaaS because I'm spending the bills, and I know about cost savings, and I know as a CEO the efficiencies of using software. And so I think it does help bridge the track into cyber, where you might start with the conversation around, we need full visibility in all these different things, as Brian alludes to here. It's that first pillar, identity. And then we're going to start helping secure it. And so building that relationship there, we've seen successes as well.
Yeah, and the visibility, I think, it's interesting to see some of the frameworks specifically identify unauthorized applications. And I think that's also a great starting point for the conversation. Be like, hey, here's an interesting framework that a lot of the industry is aligning on. For example, CIS 2.3, I think you said it was. And so exposing the customers to a bit of that talk track, I think, is interesting. I think the challenge has always been, we're not required to do this. We have no governance that imposes that we follow this right now. This seems like a lot of extra work that you're going to charge us for to do. In some cases, if you're trying to get the customer compliant with the framework and certify them or what have you. So do we really need to do that? And of course, mileage may vary. There's a whole spectrum of the different types of responses you get based on the size and interest and budget of the customer. But largely, unless there's some hard requirement to start complying, people seem to be pushing that out until they are required to do that. What have you found, John, in your travels in this talk track to be a good way to get customers to get more on the side of proactive, risk mitigation here through the framework alignment?
Yeah, I think really just customer empathy is kind of key here. MSPs, it's a challenging world for us, or at least it was a challenging world. My MSP, I'm not there now, but like it's challenging because we work with customers of all varying shapes, sizes, industries, and ins and outs. But I guess I would try to empathize with them. I mean, if you're working with a car manufacturer or a car dealer, you just go to a car dealership. You wouldn't go and try to sell something without knowing all the details that you need to know. You have to identify your prospect, identify what cars there, you have to know all these different things. You wouldn't go start fixing the books for a business at an accounting firm without knowing all of the details. You wouldn't go set up a manufacturing floor without knowing all the ins and outs of what you're producing, what widget you're creating. And fundamentally, it doesn't matter what business you're in, you wouldn't really fly blind into your subject matter expertise. You would take the time to know all the things that are out there so that you can make informed business decisions. And that's fundamentally what you're asking your customer for when the budget on visibility here is, hey, like cybersecurity and cybersecurity frameworks, they're there for a reason, but I know you don't have to be compliant, but to get started, like I just want to know what's there so that I can work with you to understand what's important. I'm not asking to boil the ocean. I'm just asking to understand what's there within your business so that I can build a proper strategy. One that's fine tailored to your business and one that really only focuses on the problems that your business is facing. And I think personally as a business owner, I can empathize with, it doesn't matter what you're building, what you're selling, what widget you're producing, what service you're giving. Fundamentally, you have to do discovery in some way, shape, or form. And for you or for the MSP world, it's just a discovery of what's there so that you can build a robust plan. And I think just emphasizing.
I'm not going to ask everybody here to raise their hand and admit their guilt, but do you think MSPs are guilty of like, oh, well, we know security, so like we don't really have to enforce this on ourselves. Like we're okay using, these things because we understand how to avoid the potential issues. And is there really just a lack of the right culture around it at the root, which is obviously the IT side of things?
Data wise, I could just say what the data.
Yeah, what does the data show? Yeah, don't make it a personal opinion.
Yeah, I won't give it a personal opinion. I mean, it's challenging, right? If you don't have the proper software in the MSP side, you're logging in with customers' accounts, you're logging in with customer credentials in some cases to access their third-party tools and all these different things. And documentation's hard if it's manual. This is why tools exist to kind of automate that documentation, because it shows up every time in a scan internally in an MSP where we start to see shared accounts and service accounts being flagged where people are using the end client's credentials and a couple techs are sharing it to get into this weird tool that doesn't follow all the other process. But that goes back to that visibility piece. You got to know it's there so that you can remediate it on the employee offboard journey or whatever it might boil down to. So in general, I mean, the data always ends up finding it. I mean, there's always shadow IT in an organization. It just tends to be how egregious is it. And it really only boils down to just building a list of how you're going to remediate it and what's important to go solve. But of course, MSPs have shadow IT. I mean, even when I was at my MSP, like we cooked up code all the time to go solve problems that were just these little tribal knowledge things, or we signed up for a tool that was just tribal knowledge that we supported it. And, as we want to make sure we're automating the documentation of our client, we want to make sure we're automating the documentation on our business, because tribal knowledge stuff is going to happen. It's just a matter of building something to have visibility into it to when you need to react to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd love to, if anyone has a story that they may have come across, an alarming discovery perhaps, and how we resolved it, feel free to, raise your hand or turn on your video and jump in. Sometimes just hearing the stories from the trenches helps us identify situations we would have never thought we were going to come across. And this is one of the reasons I love talking to other MSPs, because you hear about the stuff that you're like, oh, I never thought of that. Would never expect a client or an end user to do that particular thing. And so you might be saving another MSP's life by sharing your story. Brian.
I've got an interesting one, really getting into the co-managed and kind of VAR space. And I wonder, what is the definition of shadow IT? Because we took on a client that had a single IT person that had been there for 30 years. And the administrative staff, after we got in there and pointed out all the things going on, had no idea half of it was happening. So I wonder if shadow IT is anything that the people that are responsible for taking ownership over risk for an organization need to be in line with IT. And if there's things happening with IT and these people that make decisions around risk aren't made aware about it, they, now all of a sudden, I would even call that shadow IT. And that, you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
And that's why I said in the beginning, you nailed it, Brian. Like in the beginning, I mentioned the context was shadow IT is anything the IT team doesn't know about, which means in this case, if you're an MSP, it's things that you don't know about. But I think shadow IT context changes, especially in those co-managed relationships that you talked about.
Yeah, I think those are challenges that I think we come across all the time. Like even previous or incumbent MSPs sometimes have been a bit neglectful, and I think the complacency is a real problem that every MSP faces, because we're great at sort of kicking off the project, starting the onboarding, doing the initial set of things, but the recurring sort of repetitive management is sometimes boring and unexciting. And this is something I think technicians pursue, is sort of what's the new exciting thing? What is the fire that needs to be put out right now? And in that process of chasing our own tail, especially smaller MSPs they can't dedicate a person to the ongoing management or ongoing review and stuff. We'll end up just neglecting some of these things. Or we need more revenue, and so we're focused on projects and not on the ongoing management. And these are, some of the tools are obviously solving for this now, because they can give you the reports and let you know when you need to pay attention to stuff. But this wasn't the case, for decades. Just up to a few years ago, there was no SaaS management platform for MSPs that could really give you that insight. So anyways, kudos to John for really identifying that gap and coming out and building it. I think it's providing a great service to MSPs who would otherwise, I think, fall into that trap of complacency potentially. So, yeah.
All I want to add is one thing was there's a reaction that we heard from one of our partners out at DataCon, and it was I used to be scared to go into QBRs, and I to be fair, I think I'm 99% sure they're a ScalePad customer. So not scared because the system wasn't working. I used to be scared because I didn't have something to bring to the track. Like I didn't have something new to talk about. I wanted to make sure that each conversation was new and I had something fresh to talk about their business with. And that's where because shadow IT is ever evolving. It's not going to be the same this month as it is next month. 8% of the US workforce use ChatGPT between January 1 and May 1st, and half them put business data in it. But we're seeing the slow tricklation. Most people aren't using ChatGPT as much as we thought it might be as a disruptive. But that doesn't mean next quarter, the next big thing doesn't come out. That doesn't mean like the amount of SaaS tools. I always joke, if you could see behind the scenes at a SaaS company every once in a while, you'd understand how focused they are on getting out there and getting in the businesses. And there's so many people focusing on so many SaaS tools. And so there's always going to be that next thing. And that's the cool thing about shadow IT. It's a revolving door of conversation, because there's always shadow IT. There's always new SaaS that can be used to make your business more productive. And that's a cool bridge to keep coming back and talking about, like, what are the next things you're solving with tech?
Yeah, no doubt. Man, there's just so many things to be worried about, and an increasing number of things to be worried about. And of course, I think this is just a great conversation opener. Yeah, I think the automation tools are really starting to help alleviate some of this, where you may not have an integrated app, but maybe it has an API and you can sort of trigger some of these things through a tool like Roost. 100%. But this is part of the procurement problem as well. Actually, John, as we've talked about this on the advisory board over at the SaaS Ecosystem Council, because not every tool at every level of subscription gives you those capabilities. Not everybody will give you an API that has user provisioning in it. And again, it's too late by the time you find out they're using it because you didn't have a chance to evaluate, procure the thing properly. And so, but it's, now the data's in there. And so reversing is almost more painful than, trying to inculcate a bit of that culture, but it's a bit of a vicious cycle.
Well, I joke, right? Like I put some in chat. One of my favorite websites is the SSO Wall of Shame. And I joked about you should see the insides of a SaaS company. Like, you better bet a lot of these companies have talked about how important it is to have single sign-on as a feature, but they know they can ratchet the price up to make sure they spend more if there's SSO. And I always use this as a good example. Like the SSO Wall of Shame, they are making it. There's intentional decisions not to give APIs at certain tiers. There's intentional decisions not to expose that data to prevent automated churn. And what it boils down to is, you're right. Early stage shadow IT detection can prevent this disruption in the business where now you're having to spend more in SSO. And I think one of the funnier things that a lot of people forget is there's a mountain of free software out there that is still SaaS. They're just waiting for you to click on that grade button to spend more. And that doesn't mean that they won't take a mountain of data before you get to that point. Like, they're all about taking all of the information and getting you invested in a tool before they ask your money these days with those systems. So I guess, on the fight against shadow IT, there's always tactics that are being intentionally decided. And so just trying to be proactive on it, catch it early. I know we didn't have anybody jump in and share stories, but one day I'd be happy to sit around at a fireside chat on all the different things that I've helped partners through.
I've got another story I could share real quick. That's something we haven't touched on that you guys also offer that we love, which are the vendor incidents, right? And if you're talking about low-hanging fruit with shadow IT, at least keep an eye on that page, because then when LastPass gets hit again, you know exactly who's all using it out there without your permission, or that they signed up for their own account without you even knowing, and now you need to target that audience and let them know, hey, they need to do something about this. Yeah. So that's another big point I like too.
And also, especially like LastPass, everybody read the news. Yeah. Everybody reads Forbes. They see them, right? Like, they see the events happen. So they often ask if it's happening. At least it helps you find that quicker. But it's real. Again, I think, you made the point, Luis, earlier. It's like, it doesn't matter till it hurts me. This helps you kind of find one of those moments, whether it happened, client on board, go quickly see if any of their events have been part of an exposure in the last 12, 24 months. Whether it happened under your watch or under the watch of the MSP before, you can bring up, hey, this happened. This is why this is important. This is why we want to build a maturity model. Did your last MSP bring up the fact that your team was using, GoDaddy, and GoDaddy had an exposure of user account credentials, things like that? So just start, like, we don't want to sell them FUD, but it starts the conversation around why it matters.
Yeah, it's just a continuous thing. And so much so that I think even MSPs are having a hard time keeping track of, what security bulletin boards should I be on? How do I find out when some of these apps have had issues? I mean, at least on my iPhone, sometimes Apple will advise me that one of my saved passwords was part of a breach, or an app that, had an issue, or, the 1Password app does it as well. And but otherwise, like, most people would never find out. And so this is, I think, part of the challenge, is staying in tune with what's happening. The vendors perhaps are sometimes slow to disclose while they're doing their investigations. Sometimes the FBI gets involved and they don't want anything to ruin their opportunity to maybe catch the bad guys, and so they delay, a situation. We've seen that happen. And what is the client to do? Meanwhile, all of this is going on. And so I think the retrospect, obviously, is to be able to sit down and be like, hey, these things are going to happen. And from one of the calls we did with Chris Weiser a few weeks ago, we talked a bit about the ROI of IT, right? Because I think clients, you're sort of trapped in between this, like, if we're not seeing you here enough, what are we paying you for? If we have problems, like, what are we paying you for? So this is still, the IT is focused on a lot of this productivity or the visibility of the obvious issues. But I think the shift in conversation around the ROI of IT managed services is happening now, to be like, well, if your ROI on your spend on us is zero, as opposed to negative dollars to pay for a breach, to pay for a crypto locker, to pay for any number of incidents that could cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars, then you're actually winning. You know, if your ROI is zero on what you're investing on IT, you're actually winning, because you're not losing money on some of these incidents. And not enough MSPs have made the switch to be like, hey, our job is to mitigate risk, as opposed to our job is to, you know, install your apps, because that's really not, you know, the fun part.
Something else I'd like to bring up, if you don't mind, that I really like about SaaSleo that has been a struggle historically in our industry, for us anyway, is, you know, you look at a data RMM, it'll tell you everything that's installed on the machine, but when's the last time it was used? Is this app even being used? So when you're worried about, when you think about even dark web breaches, right? That might be an app that they don't even use anymore. It still needs to be noted down, but maybe it's less of a risk. Let's focus on the apps we know they're using today, reset those. And then if they care to reset other passwords with apps that you don't have any record of them even using, they have that report to do on their own, right? But I think it's hard to understand what apps people are even using, because so many people install stuff, use it once, and then never again. Or, you know what I mean? And you're just like, is this something even needed? And our idea is that we actually want to move towards defining roles and departments, which ultimately have M365 as a source of truth, right, where we have licensing groups. And then we want to correlate that data with SaaSleo and be able to inspect what to expect. We know these roles in these departments should only be using these apps. Let's pull up a SaaSleo report and verify that's actually happening, right? Yeah.
Yeah, love it. And again, these are things that are sometimes fall prey to time constraints, or, you know, issues of, you know, other priorities. It's always the priority battle. And because they seem more management driven or management heavy, that they're always going to drop in priority to a backup issue or a ticket with a broken printer. To name a couple. So it is just, I think, a cultural, habitual thing that needs to happen over a longer period of time, and just sort of train ourselves to not give way to some of those other things. But I wanted to maybe address some of the other factors that I think are an issue here that is worth maybe bringing into the conversation, because certainly it's not just the security, but there's issues that are compounded by some of the little bits and pieces of it. Compliance is one. You know, you might not even know that you're actually regulated by FTC safeguards is a perfect example. Suddenly we have to be compliant with this framework, and there's some control around known applications, and we have no idea who in the company might be signed up for something. And like Brian's example, they may have signed up for a free account, popped in, you know, allow access to my contacts, you know, on a phone app, and it's the company directory or a shared account or something like that. And suddenly all that data is there. Because it was free, they forget about it. It's like, oh, we don't have to pay for it, so it's not a big deal. Data loss prevention, we hit that one plenty, but password reuse on personal accounts, I feel like we mentioned earlier, a bit of the personal app ecosystem is kind of a driver of a little bit of this. Does SaaSleo have a way to detect the kinds of logins that people are using for specific apps and services?
Yes. So in our repo, we've got about 125,000 apps in the platform that we've identified. We have a system that automates determination if it's like a personal app or a work app based off of some assumptions with like a scan of the app and things like that. And then what we do is we capture when you log in, if it's a corporate domain login name or if it is a non-corporate domain login name. So jharden@avic.com would be a corporate login. John@jjharden.com would be my personal login. And so a personal login to a personal app, you can find the data, but we don't bring it to the surface because we're not here to be the police. Right. It is in the offboard report and it is in the data logs. It's in the security logs. It's all monitored. But for instance, a J Harden login into Facebook.com so I can go manage my social page all of a sudden turns the app into a work app. And so we do have a mechanism that captures the username. So we're more than, I mean, from our perspective, it's just a little bit more than CIS 2123. It's CIS 5155, the account inventory and the audit logs of what's entering those SaaS tools.
Yeah.
But you're right on things like password reuse or account reuse, or that's where we're able to find like something that's not mentioned on this factor list, like people sharing those two accounts because they don't want to pay for the premium version of a tool. And you go to offboard that employee and you realize, oh, wow, half of the company is using this Gmail account to access this free tool to get their job done. We saw that in the case of, you mentioned a business is impacted by FTC safeguards. We're working with a dealership in the Northeast Coast, about 2,000 users across multiple dealerships. And when we ran a scan, what we found is the manager set up at each site, like, dealership west at gmail.com. And then everybody in the company used it to access a tool. And when they went to go offboard them the first time, they realized, oh my gosh, the entire company of all 2,000 users, every manager is setting up a Gmail for their website so people can use those tools. So wow. That's a big risk too, is what's not as sanctioned, but like even worse, like, okay, you didn't know about the app. Now you let people go. That company, that sales rep could still log in with that Gmail username password combo. It didn't get reset.
All right, we're gonna have a version 2, a follow up to this call. It shall be called Shadow IT Horror Stories, and I think even the ability to like package some of these stories up and be able to share them with clients is like, hey, here's the use case of the thing that you thought was not a big deal when you were first doing it. Again, because they're not, the client especially is not thinking down the line. They really do not understand the risks of that. And I think offboarding is so far removed from anybody's thought process in the moment when they're just trying to solve that problem, get that job done, get that task completed, that it just becomes sort of a compounded issue down the line. And sometimes you create some of these big problems. I've seen, around things like Google Analytics, where design agencies somehow have to create this like Gmail account that now like 50 people have access to in order to be able to manage all their customer accounts, because they were not a Google company themselves. Maybe they're a Microsoft 365 customer. The only way you can get into Google Analytics is like a Google account or Gmail account of some kind. And so these, decisions that were great when you were a one-person shop suddenly come to bite you when you're 50, and there's no way out of it. Like so much work would have to go into repositioning that.
I could go for hours if you need a Shadow IT horror story hour. You just give me a holler.
And it's so funny because I just got a notification in the bottom right of my my tray bar here. Marquez Brownlee, MKBHD, who's a popular YouTuber, just published a video called "Can You Trust Google?" And so I thought that was ironic based on what we were just talking about. But what a great topic. I think there's so much more in here. I'm gonna ping you for that fireside chat, John, or start collecting some of these stories to share. I think the key piece is also like, what is the moral of that particular story, and how to have a communication conversation with the client about avoiding that in the future. Just getting them tuned into some of the things that can happen and work to avoid certain, lazy decisions is the best way to describe it. But thank you so much for your time. We're sort of getting close to the top of the hour here, so we'll let folks get back to their day. Once again, thank you for joining us. A reminder that next week, and we'll send this update in the email follow-up next week, this Zoom link will be moving to a Mark Ignacio hosted LCI booster session on Wednesdays. And then
you're all mine.
Yeah, you're all his going forward. And so, but he'll be obviously diving into some of the LCI specific topics. We do have that Simple Sat webinar next week on the 11th. And then look forward to seeing everybody on the Friday slot. We're hoping to expand a bit of the topics to be a little bit more broad in nature. I love this type of conversation because you really start to understand, we should be doing something about shadow IT in this case. And whether or not, SASIO or Avik SaaS management is in place, I think the conversation should be started, and you can start to get the clients thinking about it. Because in true MSP style, a lot of folks are gonna be like, well, we're not gonna buy that until we have a customer that wants to pay for it, right? And they're gonna wait until they have a use case to help pay for the tool. So start having the conversations. I think it's the easiest way to make sure you have a way to cover the cost of the tool if you want to do that in the future.
Yep.
John, thank you so much. Brian, thanks for your commentary and questions. Appreciate you jumping in. To everybody else, have a wonderful long weekend. It's actually Thanksgiving Day in Canada on Monday, so a bunch of us will be offline. You'll see an email follow-up on Tuesday. Peace out, everybody. Thanks so much.
Cheers.